Hi, my name is Tricia Glazebrook. I'm here today with Emmanuela Opoku. We are going to present our paper to you, Hunger Crises in Ghana, a case study of impediments to women farmers' capacity to respond to climate impacts. In 2015, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reported that 27% of the world's hungry live in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, families largely depend on women's subsistence farming to meet daily food security needs. In Ghana's Upper East region, over 28% of the population has been experiencing severe or moderate food insecurity since 2012. The purpose of this paper is to examine women farmers' situations in Northeast Ghana to document the gender biases that exacerbate their capacity to respond to climate change in their farming. Analysis identifies social and economic impediments, for example, that is recalcitrant local gender bias, disproportionate workloads, invisibility of labor, and lack of access to land tenure, extension technologies, and financial support. Implications are that women's agricultural adaptation strategies are hampered by poverty and exclusion from support systems, and that women have reduced access to climate finance because local biases extend and complicate the gap between planning at the national level and implementation locally. First, we will describe our methods in the paper. Then we provide background information on women's farming and food security in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by identification of climate impacts on African agriculture in general and Ghanaian agriculture in particular. We close with discussion of gender biases that deny women farmers access to what they need in order effectively to adapt their agriculture to climate impacts. And these women are resilient, so they have worked out strategies for themselves, but they can't do enough because they don't have the resources, so they need more support. As it stands now, women in Ghana's Upper East are replacing crops such as protein and calcium-laden millet and protein-laden groundnut with drought-resistant rice that has virtually no dietary value. So these women are being obliged to sacrifice their nutritional base simply to have something to put in the child's stomach. Our goal is not to suggest solutions and policy interventions, but to raise awareness of the crisis in food security and hunger already ongoing in Africa and well underway in Ghana's Upper East region that is likely being replicated across the savanna ecosystem that extends from the Atlantic into East Africa. Now, with respect to our methods include examination of policy documents and academic literature, naturally, and also field research collected longitudinally from 2007 to 2020 in Ghana's Upper East region. Previously, that area was the northern part. Previously, the northern part of the Upper Eastern, this area was the northern part of the Upper Eastern region that was then divided into the Upper East and Northeast in 2019. So the older parts of the research refer to it as the Upper Eastern region rather than as the Upper East. So I hope that that's not complicating for people. I'm actually not going to read the rest of the information about the methods because it's available to you in the paper that was posted in the media section of the conference for our event. And it's a bit tedious because it's just details, so you can look at it there for yourself. Instead, I'm going to turn the discussion over now to Dr. Opoku, who is going to talk to you about women's farming and food security in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glazebrook. I'll go ahead and discuss women's farming and food security in sub-Saharan Africa. Concerning women's farming, agriculture is the primary livelihood for 1.4 billion women globally who live in rural areas. In the global south, women make up 43% of the agricultural workforce. Half of these women live in sub-Saharan Africa, where agriculture employs approximately 60% of women. Though in rural areas of the least developed countries, women grow up to 89% of what is consumed. Rural women handle livestock, grow and gather food, store, process and prepare food, gather fodder, and fuel wood. They also manage domestic water supply and provide most of the post-harvest labor. In Africa, 26% of households containing 20% of the population are also headed by women, who often head disadvantaged households. Documentation shows that women are also responsible for growing enough food to feed 17 people in their own households. Women are largely responsible for farming for the family and providing food security. Considering food security, in 2015, over 98% of the hungry worldwide were in the global south, and over a quarter, which is about 27.7% of them, also approximately 220 million people were in Africa. 19 of Africa's 48 sub-Saharan countries, almost 40%, had the number of hungry Africans that had reached 257 million. Meanwhile, the director of the 2018 Food and Agricultural Organization Regional Conference in Africa, Jose Graciano de Silva, announced that Africa would meet its goal of complete eradication of hunger by 2015, 5 years before the Sustainable Development Goals reached their expiration. We haven't seen that happen. This promise may be unrealistic. However, in the UN World Food Programme 2020 hunger map, 4 of the 6 countries in the worst category, more than 35% of the population, are still in chronic hunger in Africa. In the next category of 25 to 34.9% in chronic hunger, 5 of the 8 countries are in Africa. In the next category of 25, I just repeated myself. In the next category of 25 to 34.9% in chronic hunger, 5 of the 8 countries are in Africa. That is 9 of the 14 countries in the world that have at least every 4th person suffering chronic hunger are in Africa. The World Food Programme reports that no data is available for 12 sub-Saharan African countries, so the numbers are likely in fact worse, and places several of these countries in its list of global hotspots for hunger that will stretch the UN Food Relief Agency to the limit. Food insecurity persists in Ghana. About 1.2 million people, that is 5% of Ghana's population, were already food insecure by 2008, and another 2 million people vulnerable to being pushed into food insecurity. Food insecurity is a threat in Ghana because many families depend on subsistence agriculture, that is food grown for consumption rather than sending to the market. And this is plagued by declining yields and the use of rudimentary technology. The Upper East ecosystems is Guinea savanna, except one area that is Sudan savanna. The savanna is a dry, semi-desert ecosystem that is fragile and vulnerable to changing weather patterns. Farmers in the Upper East depend virtually entirely on the rains to grow their crops. Vulnerability differs, moreover, according to multidimensional inequalities, including gender, and the greatest vulnerability is to those who are marginalized socially, economically, culturally, politically, and institutionally. Women farmers in Africa are marginalized in all these ways, so it can be expected that impacts have already been and will continue to be especially harsh for Africa's women farmers who have sparse resources to respond to increasing climate stresses. I'll turn over the next session to Dr. Glazebrook to do the presentation.
Okay, so women in the Upper East. and Northeast regions grow at least 55% of agricultural produce, though the Social Watch Coalition attributes 87% of what is eaten in these regions to women's farming. Food insecurity is more severe in northern Ghana's northern, upper west, and upper east regions than in any other area of the country. These regions are not rich with natural resources, and the income per capita of the inhabitants falls far below the national average. They constitute Ghana's most underdeveloped regions and have been described as the most poverty-stricken with the most hunger spots in Ghana. It's estimated that more than 680,000 people, representing 16% of the three regions' populations, are considered either severely or moderately food insecure, with 140,000 people being severely food insecure in these regions in the north of Ghana. 28% of those who are severely food insecure live in the Upper East region, as compared to so that's 16% of the population, as compared to the Upper West region and the northern regions. So I'm going to talk briefly now about climate impacts on agriculture generally, before I turn it over to Dr. Opoku to talk about climate impacts in particular in Ghana. You actually had skipped a page there, Emmanuela, so you want to make sure that you're moving next onto page 4. Okay. So climate impacts on agriculture, you probably already know quite a lot about this since you're in this meeting, so I'm going to go fairly quickly. So we know that climate change is a threat multiplier for hungry and undernourished people. Combined with conflict, it destroys livelihoods, drives displacement, widens inequalities, and undermines sustainable development, including the Sustainable Development Goal of zero hunger by 2030. Agriculture is deeply connected with poverty in Africa, especially for women who grow subsistence crops to feed their family in the mutually exacerbating so-called feminization of agriculture and feminization of poverty. As globally, the female proportion of the agriculturalists and the poverty-stricken increases, for the women. Africa was in fact the only country not to achieve the 2015 Millennium Development Goal of 50% poverty reduction. So we don't know how it's going to do with the SDGs either. According to the 2007 Fourth Assessment Report, AR4, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the number of extreme weather-related disasters globally had doubled in the early 1990s. This led to reduced yields of major crops and contributed to increases in food prices and decrease in income. AR4 noted growing climate impacts of temperature rise, indeterminate precipitation patterns, sea level rise, and intensifying hazards such as storms, floods, and droughts that have severe implications for the African continent, particularly vulnerable areas that aren't, they can't put up with a lot of changing climate conditions, as in the northern area of Ghana, and I'm sure in the areas north of it, moving up to the Sahara as well. So, these extreme weather events disproportionately harm low-income people and their access to food. The fifth assessment report in 2014 further indicates, sorry about that. So let me just find out where I was. Sorry, I got this trouble with these watches, these new fancy watches. So the fifth assessment report further indicates that studies covering a wide range of regions and crops generally report negative climate impacts on crop yields. As a result of climate impacts, agricultural land is becoming less productive. Pinto et al. Report that climate change can create water and heat stresses, increase incidence of pest and disease outbreak, lead to the loss of productive land through the deterioration of ecosystems, and add additional burdens to supply chains, including post-harvest losses during storage and distribution. That is, globally, farmers can expect yield reductions, decreased livestock values, post-harvest losses, and reduced food accessibility and consumption. AR5 also notes with high confidence, and as you probably know from looking at the IPCC, they have these classifications of how confident they are in the result, how much the group agreed, and how much they were in disagreement, and all these factors that you can use to evaluate, the metadata that allows you to evaluate how reliable the information is. So high confidence, it means that it's very strongly expected that this would be the case, right? So AR5 also notes with high confidence that Africa's agricultural productivity is expected to be near minimum risk by 2030 and well into that risk by 2080, even with adaptations. And that's the terrifying part, because it means that there might not be a way that is possible to respond. And that's only if the global mean surface temperature, the GMST, rises above pre-industrial levels by 2 degrees centigrade. A GMST rise of 4 degrees centigrade, however, puts African agriculture at very high risk by 2080, which seems like a long way away, but it's really not. People who are born now will still be alive then. So vulnerability differs, moreover, according to multidimensional inequalities, including gender. And the greatest vulnerability is to those who are marginalized socially, economically, culturally. So gender is particularly vulnerable here to these climate impacts. And women farmers in Africa are marginalized in all those ways, socially, economically, culturally, politically, and institutionally. So it can be expected that the impacts of climate change have already been and will continue to be especially harsh for Africa's women farmers who have sparse resources to respond to increasing climate stresses. I'm now going to turn you over to Dr. Opoku again to speak directly to issues of climate impacts in Ghana.
Thank you, Professor Glazebrook. Climate impacts in Ghana. Evidence in Ghana of climate impacts and understanding of the consequences of the Ghanaian population is readily available. We have data from Mawenya and Adiko 2013, Ashanti and Amwaku Mensah 2014 to support this. The World Bank 2010 notes in particular the impacts of changing temperature and changing rainfall. So two main impacts there, changing temperatures and then changing rainfall patterns are what we experience most in Ghana. The Environmental Protection Agency of Ghana also knows temperature rises and unpredictable rainfall across all of the ecological zones in the country. This may not be too surprising as climate factors in Ghana are rarely stable with high interseasonal and interannual variations. Concerning temperature, an assessment by the EPA using a 1960 as the baseline concluded that the mean annual temperature in Ghana had increased by 1 degree Celsius, which is in fact high, across the country by 207. That is a 0.21 degrees Celsius per decade, which cannot be accounted for in terms of seasonal or annual variations. The Climate Change Risk Profile of Ghana 2017 also anticipates increases in average annual temperature between 1.4 to 5.8 degrees Celsius by 2018 and expects the average number of hot nights per year in the north of the country, including the Upper East region, which is the focus of this presentation, to increase by 18 to 59% in frequency by 2060. Hotter means drier, which shortens the growing season, makes for decreased productivity, and threatens soil health and resilience by enabling increased erosion. So we know what this has for food security, especially for our women farmers. Now let's go to rainfall. Concerning rainfall, a well-defined cumulative reduction of 2.4% per decade is projected to reach 4.4% reduction by 2040. With more erratic and intense rainfall during the wet season and lower precipitation levels during the dry season. So what this means is that in the rainy season, sometimes the rains are late, but they are very intense, at some months, and then they are also shorter, making it difficult for growing food. Rainfall in Ghana is moving toward a longer dry season and a vanishing wet season, according to Owusu et al. 2008. Recent reductions in food production is linked to drought events, MOFA 2017, and desertification is estimated to be taking over 20,000 hectares in Ghana each year. The agricultural sector in Ghana is recording low productivity because of the dependence on rainfall, which makes farming highly vulnerable to climate vulnerabilities, especially in the northeast part of the country. So this signifies how climate impacts are really affecting food growth in terms of affecting temperature and rainfall. I would turn it back to Dr. Glazebrook to talk about gender bias.
Yeah. And when we talked earlier about crop selection, changing to rice. The thing about rice is it'll grow steadily if it gets rain at different times. It just sits there and waits until it rains again.
Mhm.
But when the rains are sporadic, which is something consistently happening each year now, it means that crops like millet and groundnut don't grow very well because they need rain pretty much every day in the usual cycle that the rainy season used to typically bring, right? So even if there aren't extreme events, the sporadic falling of the rain is deeply problematic for growing foods that are actually, have a strong nutritional base. So the last section that I'm going to present to you now is actually on the issues of gender bias, which is a focal point in the paper for us and which we promised you at the beginning. So women face significant bias as farmers globally, and it's actually a bit upsetting, or the comparison between the global north and the global south makes it absolutely clear that the same gender biases, despite this radical economic differential, the same gender biases apply to women in the global north as the global south when they are farmers. So it's clearly a sector where there hasn't been a lot of, moving forward on gender either in the north or the south with respect to supporting women's farming. So women in Africa, including Ghana, are often denied land tenure. They can't buy or own land. They're in fact only 12.6% globally of landowners, despite the agricultural sector accounting for almost 2/3 of women's employment globally. A gender gap in agriculture holds women farmers back by reinforcing persistent inequalities that affect women's access to resources and undermine their food security. Over half of the 2.5 billion people relying on subsistence agriculture for their livelihood, i.e. over 50%, are women who, in comparison with men, are more vulnerable to livelihood insecurity, have less capacity to access resources, and have less collective voice, have constrained agency, and have a much smaller role in household and community decision-making. Despite responsibility for family food security, women are consistently under-resourced and held back by gender bias and socio-political marginalization. In Ghana, women still struggle because of inequalities that were identified decades ago, yet still have not been addressed. They face long-standing persistent bias, including weak land tenure rights, virtually never owning in land, and there's a couple of exceptions, but virtually never owning land in Ghana. So they are insecure with respect to their access to the land and if they'll be able to continue growing on it. They also suffer from limited access to machinery, limited access to credit and finance, fertilizers, labor, and to agricultural extension services. And moreover, they are excluded from particular farming practices, such as, for example, agroforestry. Men hold more than 3 times as many farms as women, and over 8 times as many farms that are 5 or more acres, which constitutes medium and large-sized farms, 8 times what women own in that area. Meanwhile, 89% of women in the area where we are doing in sub-Saharan Africa do at least 10 hours of domestic labor each week, while 65% of men do 0 to 10 weekly hours of domestic labor. This inequity begins in childhood. More than 50% of girls aged 7 to 10 contribute as much as 50 hours of domestic labor each week to their family, while 80% of boys that age contribute 10 or less hours. So women and girls have a larger labor burden than men, yet are economically disadvantaged. So the story that if you work harder, you get more in return is actually not the case, but we already know that, right? At the same time, factors such as pollution, climate change, and degradation of water, land, and forests affect women disproportionately because it is women who largely bear the brunt of coping in their role of subsistence farmers responsible for family food security and other domestic responsibilities such as water and fuel collection. To conclude then, it is thus urgent that Africa's women farmers gain parity, equity, and opportunity through increased access to credit, savings, and land ownership, and the same rights as men to resources and participation in decision-making. If the accelerating increase of hunger in Africa is to be addressed before it becomes an unstoppable humanitarian crisis in starvation. Thank you for listening to us.